Infiniti Fx45 front propeller shaft replacement. I'm Brian Esser from How to Automotive. I'm going to walk you step by step through the process of changing out the front propeller shaft. On this job, I was using a factory replacement drive shaft. If it's available, I will link it up in the description. If not, you have to check with your local dealer. Now, the book wants you to remove the cat or the exhaust manifolds to do that. So I went ahead and ordered up the exhaust manifolds and gaskets that we need to do that. But when I was doing this job, the exhaust manifold bolts, heat shields and stuff were frozen and didn't want to come out. So I figured out a way how to remove this drive shaft and reinstall it without removing the exhaust manifold and cat. The original labor for this job was about 3 hours. That was including removing the exhaust manifold. So I figured out how to take it out and put it back in without doing that, and it saved me about an hour and a half. So I'm going to walk you through the process of how I did that. I've removed a few of the bolts from the rear cat here, and I also removed the oxygen sensor wiring here and a few brackets, and I'm going to walk you step by step through how I did this, and it's going to save you a ton of time and a ton of effort doing this. So I got the vehicle up on the hoist, and I'm going to get started by disconnecting the oxygen sensor here. So what you normally would do is push the two connectors together and then squeeze the tab and then pull, and that will disconnect it. But this particular one was frozen, so I had to use some clip pliers here to squeeze the tab and then pull on it to get it disconnected. These particular pliers are used to remove panel clips, stuff like that, but I use them like on connectors like this all the time because you can get in there and squeeze the little tab. So on this one, even after squeezing the tab with the pliers, it still would not come undone. So what I did was unbolt the bracket that it's mounted to, and it was one 10mm bolt mounted right on the transmission pan. Now I pulled it down here where it's in a better place where I can work on it, and I was able to use my pliers here, squeeze the tab, and pull the connector free and get it disconnected like this. Now I'm going to remove this support bracket that goes from one exhaust to the other exhaust, so it crosses over, kind of supports them. It has four 14mm fasteners holding on 2 bolts, 2 nuts. To make quick work of that, I'm using my Milwaukee Tools M12 stubby impact here. Having cordless tools like this makes life a lot easier. I'll link it up in the description of the video along with all the parts that I'm using. So once I got the bracket unbolted, I had to pry it off the studs here on the left and right side. And once I got it pried off, I was about to take it out and I noticed that the wire loom was attached to it. So I used a pair of small needle nose pliers to push the little clip here and pop it off. So you just squeeze the little tabs with the needle nose pliers, and then you're able to get the wire loom off the bracket. When you go to pull this bracket out, you got to be careful not to knock the rubber bushings that are mounted onto it off. So you want to be careful not to lose those. So now that you got the bracket off, you're going to use some penetrating oil here and spray it on the exhaust bolts here. We're going to separate the exhaust right here. So we're going to remove 2 14mm nuts holding the exhaust on right here. And then once you get these 2 nuts removed, there's going to be a little heat shield that's mounted on it. We're going to work that out. So you're going to just pry it off and then kind of fish it out. Then you can use a little pry bar and pry the exhaust back and then down like this. Now you can use an 8mm Allen socket here and go ahead and remove the bolts holding the shaft onto the front differential. I used a screwdriver to wedge in between the drive shaft to crack these bolts free. And then I went ahead and spun them out, and I'm using a cordless ratchet here. So we're going to do that to all 4 of the fasteners holding it on. You just keep rotating it around and until you get all of them free. I have the transmission in neutral so everything spins freely. You can also spin the wheels on the left or right side, and that'll rotate the drive shaft around like this. Once you get all the fasteners removed from the drive shaft, then you can take a little hammer like this and tap it on the side, and that'll crack it free. And then you can use a little pry bar and pry it loose like this. So to get the drive shaft out, we need to get the drive shaft over to the right and slide forward. And to do that, the cat here and the exhaust manifold is in the way. And the book recommends that you take this out. But when I went to go take these bolts out here, that the first one I came across was frozen. It did not want to come out. It was going to break off and snap off. So what they want you to do is to take the heat shields off. And once you take the heat shields off, behind there is the nuts for the manifold. And just taking the heat shields off, I already came across a problem. That means I'm going to have to drill and all that stuff, and that's a lot extra time. So what I did was I started looking around to see if there's another way that this can be done, to see if I can get this shaft out without removing the exhaust manifold. So I removed all the plastic shields from underneath. I just went around the perimeter removing the 10mm fasteners, and there's a few clips that you need to pull off. Once you get it off, if you look right here by the sway bar, and just behind the sway bar is where the engine mounts are located. So if you look inside this hole, you can see the nut right here. We're going to remove that nut, and that's going to loosen up the motor mount on the passenger side, and then we're going to go on the driver's side. Then when we remove the nut here, I believe these are 17mm, so you're going to need a 17mm socket, an extension. I'm using my impact tool here, and I'm just going to reach up in here, pull the two nuts off. The reason why we're doing this is we're trying to create more space to get the drive shaft into a better place where we can get it out. So if you look here, it's hitting the side of the exhaust manifold, or the cat right here. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a block of wood and put it underneath the oil pan, and we're going to jack the engine up. So I use a block of wood and a pole jack here, and I'm going to screw the pole jack up. It's going to lift the engine up about an inch, inch and a half. We don't want to go too high, just enough to create enough space and gap to get the drive shaft out. So I'm lifting it up about an inch and a half. Once I got it up about an inch and a half, I went back here in the back and I double checked my my clearance here, and I'm closer. I got it off to the right more, but it's still quite not enough to get it to slide forward. So I noticed it was making contact with the rack and pinion here and some of the hoses going to the power steering pump. So what I did was I took the 10mm bracket bolt here that's holding this hose on, this line on, and then I tried to move the hose left or right just to get a little bit more clearance to see if it'll work. So it gave me a little bit more room, and I was a little closer to getting the drive shaft to slide forward here, but it's still making contact with the exhaust. So what I decided to do was I was looking around and I looked at the rack, and I realized it's not that hard to take out 4 bolts and see if it'll drop down. So that's exactly what I did on the passenger side. I took out the two 17mm nuts here, or bolts here, using my Milwaukee Impact. Now on the driver's side, I removed the two 19mm bolts. I had to use my ratchet here. I had to crack these free with a regular ratchet loose first, and then use my cordless ratchet to run the bolts out. And once I got the bolts run out, now the rack and pinion will drop down about 2 or 3 inches. And now you're able to slide the drive shaft forward. And as it slides forward, you can see back here it's coming out of the transfer case. And now to get it down and out of the transfer case, we need to remove this rear support bracket here holding up the rear transmission and transfer case. So I used a pole jack and a block of wood to lift up the rear of the transmission and hold it in place. Now I'm going to use my impact gun to remove the 6 fasteners holding the bracket on. So they're 14mm bolts. I started on the passenger side here and removed the 2 brackets. It has this little heat shield that's going to come down with it. Then I moved over to the driver's side and removed the 2 14mm bolts here. And then once you get these 2 14mm bolts removed, then right in the center of the bracket is going to be 2 14mm nuts that you're going to remove. And once you get these 2 nuts removed, then the whole bracket will drop down. So you want to be prepared to catch it. You don't want to just take out the last bolt. It will fall straight down. Now you're able to slide the drive shaft forward more and then pull it out of the transfer case, out of the rear, and then pull it out of the car like this. And now you can see how bad this was chewed up. It was really in bad shape. Nose your drive shaft back into position. So you're going to nose it in towards the front of the vehicle and push it in as far as you can. And then you're going to lift the rear of the shaft upwards. And once you're going to angle the pinion into it like this. So you're going to use both hands to guide it in. So you'll angle it in like this. And once you got it lined up, then you can push it into the transfer case. And you'll have to use your other hand to help guide it because it's want to catch on to everything here. So you're going to use both hands. One to line up the rear of the drive shaft, and one to push it forward. And once you get it all lined up, you just slide it in until it's fully seated into the transfer case. I also wanted to point out that no fluid came out of this when we did this. So once you get it all lined up, you're going to go ahead and start the bolts. So you're going to stab it into the transfer case, swing up the drive shaft into place. Now you can go ahead and start the bolts on the drive shaft here onto the coupler on the differential. I use blue thread locker on the threads of the bolt to make sure it doesn't vibrate loose and come back off. So once I got all the Allen bolts run back in and snugged up, then I used a pry bar to wedge it in the drive shaft here to hold it in place against the oil pan. And then I torqued all 4 of the bolts down to 29 foot-pounds. Now that the drive shaft's secure, you can go ahead and put the bracket on the rear back on. Start all the fasteners by hand. There's an arrow pointing forward, so you want that pointing towards the front of the vehicle when you put this bracket back in. Run it in until it's snug, and then once it's all snug, then you can torque it down with a torque wrench to 49 foot-pounds, each one of these bolts. Once they're all torqued down, you can go ahead and remove the pole jack and get this out of your way. After that, we're going to move up front towards the front pole jack that's holding the front of the oil pan up, and we're going to go ahead and lower this down. So you're going to screw this down, and the motor mounts will drop back into the little slots here. If you look, we never raised it up high enough where it came completely out. So all you need to do is just lower the pole jack and lower the engine back down into its little cradle. And then once it's all the way lowered down, you can go ahead and remove the pole jack and block of wood and get this out of your way now. Now you can go ahead and start the two nuts that hold the motor mounts on. You can run these in with a long extension like this. Once you got them run in and snug, you can use a torque wrench and torque them down to 68 foot-pounds. And you're going to do that for both left and right motor mount. Now that we've got the engine mounts retorqued, we're going to put the rack and pinion back into position. So we're going to lift it back up, and we're going to start the bolts. I'm going to recommend you start all four of them at one time. The ones on the passenger side had these washers that were behind the rack and pinion, so you're going to make sure you put the washers on and don't forget those. And then we can go ahead and start all four of the bolts on the left and the right side. Once we got all four of them started, then we can run them in until they're snug, and then we're going to torque these all down. Also, if you're having trouble getting these bolts started, what you can do is you can take your hand and put them on the wheel and move the wheel left or right, and that'll move the rack and pinion slightly left and right, and then you can push up and down to line it up, and you can get all four of the bolts started. Now we can run them down until they're snug, and then we'll torque them down. Now that you've got the steering rack bolts run in until they're snug, you can torque the 17 millimeters on the passenger side here. We're going to torque these down to 62 foot-pounds. Once you get those torqued down, you're going to torque the ones on the driver's side, which are a little larger, to 110 foot-pounds. Now I'm going to re-secure the line that I took off the bracket here, the little 10 millimeter bolt holding the power steering hoses on. So I went and re-secured that. So now we're ready to slip the exhaust back into place. I was looking at the exhaust gasket here, and the one that's on there is in pretty good shape, and the one that they came with, the new one, is a little bit different design, and I like the old one better. So I'm going to reuse this one. If it leaks, then I'll take it back off. But luckily for me, it didn't leak. So I went ahead and put the exhaust back into place. So I had to use a pry bar to pry it back far enough to get it over the studs. Once I got it over the studs, I slid it into place. Now I can take the little heat shield that went around it and go ahead and put that in place. So I slipped this on, and then I went ahead and started the fasteners. But once I got it all started, I didn't tighten it down. I left it loose until I get that cross member bracket installed. So I went ahead and started these two fasteners. Now I'm going to slip this bracket back into place. I'm going to make sure that these rubber bushings didn't fall off. They're still there. So when I went to put it in, I slipped it in behind the cross member bracket here and into place. So I angled it in there, and then I hooked it onto the two studs on the exhaust left and right side. Once I got those all on there, then I went ahead and started the fasteners on the right side and left side, and then put the two bolts going up vertical. Once I got all four of the fasteners started by hand, then I went ahead and tightened up the two exhaust manifold bolts and the four fasteners holding the bracket from left to right side. Now you can go ahead and plug the oxygen sensor back in. Once you get that plugged back in, then you can start the 10 millimeter bolt that holds the bracket on. It bolts onto the oil pan or the transmission pan here. So go ahead and bolt that back up, and then the wire loom that was clipped onto the little bracket, go ahead and clip that all back into place and secure that. I also did this all by hand. I didn't use any power tools on this one because the transmission gasket, I didn't want to damage that, so I just ran it in with a 1/4 inch ratchet here until it's snug, and then gave it about a 1/4 turn or so more. Once that's secure, you can go ahead and put the lower splash shields back up and bolt those up. So you're going to use the combination of the bolts and clips that came out with it. So now you're going to go for a drive and make sure that there's no exhaust leaks, no rattles from the drive shaft or the propeller shaft. And I will link up all the parts and tools that I use in this video in the description. I'm Brian Nessa from How To Automotive. I'd like to thank you guys for watching. Encourage you to subscribe. Invite you to head over to the howtoautomotive.com website for more valuable videos like this. Thank you again for watching.